Our third panel will focus on the chemical structure of synthetic cathinones. Our panelists are Dr. Terrence Boos and Dr. Gregory Dudley. Dr. Boos is the section chief of the Drug and Chemical Evaluation Section, Office of Diversion Control, Drug Enforcement Administration. Dr. Boos's responsibilities include managing a multidisciplinary group of scientists. The group routinely initiates studies to increase and apply scientific knowledge as it pertains to drugs of abuse and chemicals for regulatory control, and provides scientific support to federal, state, and local public health and law enforcement officials related to drugs of abuse. Additionally, the section provides scientific support to federal prosecutors. Before joining DEA, Dr. Boos was a research fellow at the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the Drug Design and Synthesis section. Dr. Dudley is the Eberly Family Distinguished Professor and Chair of the C. Eugene Bennett Department of Chemistry at West Virginia University since 2016. Previously, he was on the faculty in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at the Florida State University from 2002 to 2016, during which time he also served, first informally, then formally, on the graduate faculty in the College of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee. In addition to his numerous scientific publications, Dr. Dudley has provided expert testimony in many federal and state court cases involving synthetic controlled substances. Dr. Dudley received a Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry from Florida State University in 1995 and a PhD in Organic Chemistry from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2000. Dr. Boos.
Good morning, Judge Pryor and distinguished members of the United States Sentencing Commission. On behalf of the DA, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to briefly discuss synthetic cathinones and to really provide some information on this very important issue. Synthetic cathinones represent a structural class of substances have rapidly appeared on the designer drug market. And in response to traffic and abuse of these substances, DEA has been required to utilize all tools in a response to protect the public. The rapid proliferation of the cathinones represents a continued challenge for both law enforcement and public health. This is highly relevant, for in some cases, these cathinones have become the psychostimulant of choice for users. Substances from this class continue to be slightly altered in their chemical structure in an attempt to circumvent regulatory controls while maintaining that ever-important pharmacological effect. In a straightforward manner, the cathinone class is easily recognizable and serves as a means of grouping substances that share a minimum cathinone skeleton. It remains evident traffickers are trolling the scientific and patent literature for new cathinones to introduce on the designer drug market. As new substances from this class appear, the DEA rapidly mobilizes to collect information on the specific substance. The chemical structure is extremely critical. It plays a guiding role in our activities and what tests we are going to conduct. This information is used to prioritize the most harmful and persistent substances for regulatory control, but it also is used in legal proceedings. In an attempt to keep pace with the new substances being encountered, some countries have responded with class controls on the cathinones based on their chemical structure. The scientists in DEA's Drug and Chemical Evaluation section are frequently required to testify at sentencing hearings in order for a court to determine that substance in a guideline most similar to the newly controlled substance or possibly the analog. Our section often provides both a chemist and pharmacologist to testify as to the criteria established by the Commission under Application Note 6. These are resource intensive for all involved, especially considered testimony may be requested for the same substance in multiple cases. Likewise, the defense will also provide experts at a sentencing hearing. These hearings at times are contested, and the court must wade through complicated scientific evidence. Even after one court reaches a conclusion about a guideline comparison, other courts can and do relitigate the issue, sometimes with disparate results. The consideration of providing sentencing equivalencies for a drug class would assist courts, prosecutors, and defense attorneys in providing greater certainty for all involved. This remains an issue, for there are many cathinones that remain possible. DEA is committed to working. The DEA is committed to doing everything we can do to address this threat. We look forward to working with the Commission to address these substances. Again, thank you for considering this issue, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Booth. Dr. Dudley.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to return and testify before the Commission. In April, I advanced the idea of a categorical coverage for synthetic cathinones. This is an idea that I think has merit. It's certainly not without particular complications with regard to the pharmacological effects, but in terms of chemical structure, it can certainly bring a lot of clarity to the guideline coverage for cathinones. So here, my opinions and recommendations here focus on cathinones as a structure class, with the understanding and the background that cathinones are generally associated with stimulant properties. There are cathinones in medicine, including bupropion, Wellbutrin, which is prescribed for depression, anxiety, and smoking cessation, diethylpropion, trade name amphetamine, which I believe is prescribed for obesity, for short-term treatment of obesity as an appetite suppressant, and pyrovalerone, which has shown some use for chronic fatigue. Cathinone drugs of abuse include methylone, pentylone, alpha PVP, MDPV, mephedrone, etc. Then that etc. encompasses many substances that are continuing to emerge. I support the idea of guideline revisions to address synthetic cathinones. I think this is a timely and important task. The goal should be to provide reasonably harsh penalties for emerging synthetic cathinones that are consistent with the current guidelines and that allow the guidelines to keep pace with emerging trends and emerging substances. My recommendations are primarily two. One is to list specifically methylone, alpha PVP, and MDPV, along with methcathinone, which is already in the guidelines, and or cathinone itself as the parent of the class of compounds. And either, A, allow the courts to extrapolate from these listed substances to other substances like mephedrone and ethylone, or B, also provide categorical coverage that provides guidance on cathinone substances that can be definitively identified as cathinones but are not otherwise specifically listed. Second recommendation would be to provide categorical coverage for synthetic cathinones based on chemical structure. Along with that categorical coverage should be, in my opinion, a definition of the category so that there's no ambiguity as to what is intended to be covered by the structure of cathinone derivatives, and or B, illustrative examples, for example, methylone, alpha PVP, MDPV, methcathinone, and or cathinone itself. It is my belief that categorical coverage of cathinones as a class, as a structure class, plus specific examples would provide substantial guidance to the courts in providing logical and consistent sentencing for these and other synthetic cathinones within the stimulant category. A few comments on cathinone as a structure class. These are synthetic cathinones or designer cathinones are chemical derivatives of cathinone, which is a naturally occurring molecular substance. Similarly, amphetamines are chemical derivatives of amphetamine. The chemical structure of a cathinone, of a substance in question, once it has been identified as a cathinone, we can take it as given that the chemical structure is known and unambiguously assigned to the substance, and that the substance can unambiguously be placed into the cathinone structural category. In contrast to pharmacological effects, which are often having to be guessed at based on, for example, the chemical structure. In terms of where synthetic cathinones are most appropriately placed within the guidelines, I think guideline coverage for the amphetamines, the chemical substances derived from amphetamine, provides a logical framework for listing the cathinone derivatives. For example, there are many amphetamines listed in the guidelines, methamphetamine and amphetamine at the high end. MDMA is also listed as the methylene dioxide derivative of methamphetamine, and N,N-dimethylamphetamine is also listed among others that encompass a range from about 40 to 1 in their marijuana equivalency up to methamphetamine, which is dually listed at 2,000 to 1 and 20,000 to 1. In those series of compounds, I note that the parent compound, amphetamine or methamphetamine, is the most severe, and that there are certain structural features that have been added that can be associated with different penalties. Therefore, in conclusion, I would propose that the cathinone or methcathinone derivatives should be added to the guidelines both specifically and categorically relative to methcathinone in the way that many amphetamines are added to the guidelines or have been added relative to amphetamine and methamphetamine. I believe the structural classification of cathinones will cover cathinone substances. Stimulant abuse is, of course, broader than cathinones, but this categorical coverage of cathinones would address the emerging synthetic cathinones.
Let me ask you, Dr. Dudley, about the et cetera.
Yes.
I think in the et cetera is, in my view, perhaps a large part of the problem because we don't know where these things are going. Your proposal is, you say, 1 gram of other synthetic cathinone substances. So you talk about specific synthetics, and then you say other, which I have to believe is the et cetera. Is that,
yes.
Am I right on that? And you say 100 grams of marijuana, the equivalency.
That, yes.
Okay, so my question is, how do we get there? Why is that? That is roughly 25% of some of these other things.
And roughly 2.5 times some of the others. There are, for example, N,N-dimethylamphetamine is at 40 to 1. MDMA is at 500 to 1. So there's a range of amphetamines and there are a range of stimulants. There's also methylphenidate, which is another structural class, or doesn't fall into either of those structural classes, but falls under the stimulant category.
So how do you arrive, how do you say a gram of cathinone is 380,
Yes.
and this
That
would
is
be
that is my
1/4
personal
that.
recommendation. Yes.
Pardon?
That would be my personal recommendation
Right.
for listing cathinone as equivalent to, at the same level as methcathinone, similarly to the way amphetamine and methamphetamine are at the same point in the guidelines.
How does that conversion would apply to methamphetamine?
I'm sorry?
If you could give us the equivalent, this is substantially lower than methamphetamine with a conversion to marijuana equivalents.
Right, so
Significant.
amphetamine and methamphetamine are both already listed in the guidelines. Methcathinone is already listed in the guidelines, and I would recommend adding cathinone to the guidelines at the same level as methcathinone. And then the substituted derivatives of cathinone and methcathinone, like methylone, which is the MD derivative of methcathinone, I would recommend listing that new substance as something lower than methcathinone itself, in the same way that the MD derivative of methamphetamine is listed lower than methamphetamine itself. So MDMA is at 500 to 1, methamphetamine is at 2,000 or 20,000 to 1.
And that's what I understood
Yeah.
you to say, but I'm trying to figure out, what you've constructed here is sort of a chart to give an overall in your view, an overall coherence to the relative treatment for these drugs that we've given to other drugs.
Yes.
That's what I hear you saying. And I don't know whether what we've done with other drugs makes sense or not. But I'm asked, that the testimony I've heard today is pretty frightening in terms of impact on an individual who takes these drugs. So I don't know where I come out. I'm trying to figure out why you've come out to saying, well, it should be 25% or 30% of some other drug? And is it because you think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is it because you think that really overall, the harm that's caused by this drug in question is maybe 25, I mean, is less harmful by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4 than the other drug? Is that been your experience, or is it just sort of a formula of convenience? That's what I'm trying to figure out, the underpinning of it.
Right. So what I think broadly is that stimulant abuse is a big problem. And the testimony that we've heard this morning about people overdosing on new cathinones reflects a combination of the danger of specific synthetic cathinone substances coupled to the availability, the novelty, and the lack of information, in particular with regards to what is a toxic dose. There is a larger history, for example, with cocaine abuse that might allow a new user to differentiate between what is the dose that might produce the desired effect for that particular user and what is likely to put someone in the emergency room or worse. That information may not have been available to people who are experimenting with new designer cathinones. That would be my general opinion, is that experimentation and abuse of stimulants in general is dangerous and is appropriate to regulate. As it comes to specific cathinone substances, I would recommend reasonably harsh penalties that would address the concerns of the emerging cathinones. If they're set too low or too high, there can be unintended consequences, potentially shifting people to non-cathinone stimulants that then resets the cycle of experimenting with new substances. How I got to these specific numbers is subjective, and I included specific numbers because I was asked for recommendations to the commission, and I thought it would be appropriate to provide specific numbers. How I got to those numbers was from looking at the broader guidelines and seeing what made sense to me, what would fit within the broader guidelines.
Can I ask you a quick question? I'm sorry, is that?
No, I
So,
appreciate it.
so the meth cathinone at 380 grams is a pre-existing standard, and so if I'm understanding you correctly, is it your opinion then that if we take that as our anchor, if meth cathinone is 380, your assessment of these other variations is that they're not as harmful, or because they're listed in a way that suggests, other than cathinone, which you put on par with it, which I guess is similar to the amphetamine, methamphetamine parallel. But for the other forms, is the reason that you decided to do those at a level that's less, is it, I guess it's a similar question, is it based on how we've dealt with other derivative substances elsewhere in the guidelines? And or is it also that you're saying these other forms are not as harmful or as potent as meth cathinone? I'm just trying to get a sense of if we use that as our anchor, why you have them as less.
Why have them as less?
Yeah, as a separate and apart from the specific number, kind of why
Right.
they're less.
Right. The answer to that is because while I am familiar with the pharmacological effects as they are understood for some of these substances, if we are talking about a structural classification, then chemical structure is the guiding set of facts behind constructing a logical sentence, or logical equivalencies. And the closest analogy in the current guidelines to the cathinones in terms of chemical structure is the amphetamines. And so I'm suggesting using methcathinone as the anchor and then listing other substituted derivatives in the cases that I that I identified as lower, because there are parallels in the amphetamine series that is more broadly, where there's broader guidance in the guidelines. So it was an attempt to be, in terms of chemical structure, consistent with the current guidelines.
One of the chemicals that you have listed, excuse me, is MDPV.
Yes.
And you have that listed at 1 to 40, is that right?
Yes.
And if my understanding of the prior testimony is correct, that actually is the substance that the two physicians from the University of Virginia testified that their patient had all those terrible effects from, right?
Yes.
And so in your opinion, that drug should receive a ratio of 1:40, which is one of the lowest ratios in the guidelines.
There are certainly lower ratios than 1:40, but among the Schedule 1, Schedule 2 stimulants, that is at the low end. And again, I think any stimulant can be subject to abuse and can result in severe health consequences for taking too much of them. And part of the problem with the emerging synthetic cathinones was a lack of information coupled with easy availability. That, in my estimation, certainly could be seen as a recipe for overdoses. That whereas the specific substance was MDPV in that particular case, any number of stimulants taken at a high level could produce severe health consequences, if not fatalities. The rationale for where I had recommended listing MDPV is, again, based on chemical structure relative, in this case, to alpha PVP or FLACA, where MDPV is the derivative of FLACA, of alpha PVP, that has that methylene dioxy ring.
Dr. Boos, do you have any reaction to the testimony from Dr. Dudley, or what's your sense?
Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit to follow the logic of why you would place these substances below that of methcathinone and others. I will share that based on our experience, the cathinones have been the most harmful and persistent substances we've encountered on the designer drug market. The effects and just we heard a portion of them from that panel earlier. They're of great concern that the user doesn't know what they're getting a hold of. They're overdosing on a substance, and they're not sure when they present medically how to treat them, and other than the conditions they present in. So for us as an agency trying to protect the public, they're an incredible challenge for us. But the harm is well established as to what they're causing to the community.
So to follow up with the question, I'm interested in what the DEA has found, if they have, as to the potency of any particular quantity in the field. It always mystifies me, that judges frequently don't look at in terms of sentencing. Well, this was 80% pure, or this was 5% pure, it was cut this way, it was cut that way, and so forth. But it obviously must have an impact on a user. Who may or may, wittingly or unwittingly, have a sense, because it's a white powder, have a sense of what is the purity, what is the level of toxicity, I guess is the right word. Do you have any experience in that area, or is that something that we should look at, or what do you think?
The purity of the drug, especially what's encountered on the illicit market, is highly dependent on where it's at in that supply.
Right.
And we've noticed that a lot of these substances come in from a foreign source. They're immediately packaged and sent out. And often what we encounter on the illicit market is highly pure substance. They haven't been cut. There are examples where they haven't cut. And in our written testimony, I gave a product, a glass cleaner, that had been combined with multiple cathinones, other stimulants. That's an example of somebody that's marketing a specific product to the user. They're asking for a product that's a strongly powerful stimulant. It's varied, but those studies as to quantitating, they're just not conducted by the forensic laboratories. It would be a special study.
And if I could ask one question just on the chemistry point to see if there is some agreement here. Do you both agree that there is a core to these cathinones that, regardless of if it's a new designer drug, we could put this chemical structure in front of you, Dr. Dudley, and you, Dr. Boos, and others, and there would be general agreement that this is a cathinone?
Yes, I think there certainly should be.
Yeah, I agree to that. There's a skeleton that's associated with this that would align an entire class of substances.
So did you hear the testimony from one of the earlier witnesses? I forget whether it was it Utah or or Ohio, that had this screen that said it's pretty easy. If it fits within the screen, it's a cathinone, and we can deal with it. That seemed like a very attractive approach for the commission to take, because it's simple, it's clear. You don't have any problem with that.
I think, based on my experience in the scientific community and based on what's also published in the literature, the class itself is very well defined and accepted.
Yes, I agree. A categorical listing of synthetic cathinones would be generally, and I think immediately and universally recommended. It would cover then all of the emerging substances that have that cathinone core. It would not necessarily capture all the emerging stimulants, but it would capture the synthetic cathinones.
Sort of followed Mr. Polito's question. You were here earlier when these cases were described, and we can see it here. And your recommendation is, I think, what, that it be treated as 100 grams?
Yes.
All right. So, of course, the harm was extreme in those cases. 40?
Yeah, I think yes.
All right. Well, whatever. I mean, it's not the extreme. However, the harm caused in these cases was as frightening as you could imagine. And actually, in the testimony, there's some examples of it. Do we know anything about, or will we be able to determine anything about the dosage that any individual took? And is this sort of, in a sense, idiosyncratic, that when you come to the conclusion based upon what you've seen, well, obviously he overdosed and took a much larger quantity of the drug than is traditionally dealt out on the street. It's the equivalent of going into some place in Colorado and buying a whole box of cookies and eating them at one time. I mean, you just don't do that. You're going to have a terrible, terrible reaction. Do we know whether that happens in the case of in the case of cathinone?
So, for example, when you look at the pharmacology of the drug, and it's comparable to that of methamphetamine. It's at least as potent as methamphetamine, if not more, if we need to talk about MDPV. And you put in a separate category the toxicity associated with MDPV. It is extremely toxic. As you heard earlier, multiple organs are affected by the drug. So you have a pharmacology that shows that it's comparative, what its comparative is as to its stimulant properties. Then you have another whole category of toxicity associated with the drug.
Dr. Booz, can I ask you though, how would you describe the effects of methcathinone? So if that's our existing anchor, how would these other types compare to that, which has, is set already at 380?
It would be a great comparative, but methcathinone isn't an extensively studied drug. You're extensively
So you said it's not?
It's not an extensive. So, for example, the pharmacologist testified in the earlier panel. Their primary comparator, cocaine, methamphetamine, and MDMA, as some of the comparatives that are traditional drugs.
And that's true of cathinone too. So methcathinone or cathinone, either one, we just don't know. Okay.
And if I could address the question as well regarding the MDPV overdoses, for example, I don't believe that clear information on the dose would have been available in at least many of the anecdotal case reports in the hospital presentations. There are serious medical consequences of overdosing on other stimulants. There are, for example, caffeine has been sold in nutrition, concentrated forms of caffeine have been sold over the counter and have led to people overdosing and dying from caffeine consumption.
Well, what would you say would be an accidental overdose amount? 5 grams?
I don't know.
If let's say it's 5 grams, that's equivalent of 200 grams of marijuana under your conversion chart. That's a range of probation for the seller that would have sold those drugs that would have caused all those consequences. Would you say that's a reasonably harsh penalty?
I think one could look at the specific numbers for doses to the extent that those are available. And that data, those pharmacological effects data can and should inform the scheduling of specific substances. But if we're talking about, or when we are talking about the pharmacological effects, those then become more specific to specific substances. Whereas what I'm proposing for the categorical coverage is based on chemical structure. To further address the statements that MDPV versus methamphetamine, I would point out that they have similar but slightly different mechanisms of action that make head-to-head comparisons complicated. MDPV is a reuptake inhibitor, whereas methamphetamine is more of a stimulates the release of the various neurotransmitters. And this can have consequences, or this can result in different outcomes depending on how you set up the experiment. And yes, the emerging synthetic cathinones have typically been compared to cocaine, MDMA, or methamphetamine by virtue of those compounds being the compounds chosen by the experimenter. The experimenter could similarly have chosen methylphenidate or Ritalin as the comparative substance, and then dimethylamphetamine or other stimulants that are currently in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2.
Okay, thank you for your presentations. Thank you, too, for your written presentations. We're going to go to our final panel.